Interpretation, finding out what the meaning of something is an important activity of scholars in almost all the humanities. Whether you are trying to translate an ancient inscription, understand the short stories of a modernist writer, or make sense of a 17th century painting, you are attempting to find out the meaning of the object that you are studying. This is a big difference with the natural sciences, since natural occurrences don't have these kinds of meanings. A volcanic eruption or the fall of an apple don't mean anything. They just happen. But the humanities study products of the human mind, and these do have meanings. It follows that an important part of the methodology of the humanities will be concerned with interpretation. How do you interpret something? What makes one interpretation better than another? And how can we argue about that in a scientific way? These questions are investigated by hermeneutics, the study of interpretation. In this lecture, we will look at the most influential idea about interpretation, an idea that almost all people who engage in hermeneutics agree with in one form or another, namely the idea of the hermeneutic circle. In later lectures, we will also get to know hermeneutics as a movement within the humanities, which doesn't just study interpretation, but also emphasizes the importance of interpretation. But for now, let's focus on this thing called the hermeneutic circle. The key insight upon which the hermeneutic circle is based is the insight that meaning is holistic. What does that mean? It means that the meaning of a whole, for instance a text, is not just the sum of the meanings of its parts. Meaning is determined by the whole as a whole, not by the parts individually. Let's try to make that more concrete. Take weight or heaviness. Weight is not holistic. The weight of a bag is simply the sum of the weight of the bag itself plus the weights of all the individual objects that are in the bag. If you add an apple that weighs 200 grams to the bag, the weight of the bag as a whole will go up by 200 grams. So we can assign weights to the individual objects, and when we put them together, we just add up the weights. That is not holistic, but its opposite, which is sometimes called atomistic. But now take tastiness. The tastiness of a dish is not the sum of the tastiness of the individual ingredients. Salmon tastes great, peanut butter tastes great, but very few people would like to eat salmon with peanut butter. A great chef, on the other hand, can mix different ingredients to create a dish that transcends the taste of any of the individual ingredients. So there is an amount of holism here. The taste of the whole is not just the sum of the tastes of the ingredients. Now, meaning is even more holistic than taste. Not only is it the case that the meaning of the whole is not just the sum of the meanings of the parts, but in fact, the parts don't even really have meanings if they are not part of a whole. Take for instance the word can. What does it mean? Well, you don't really know. It means one thing in the sentence, I can do that, and it means something else entirely in the sentence, I open a can of beans. The word can alone doesn't have a determinate meaning apart from its context. It only gets a specific meaning when it is placed in a sentence. But obviously that means that the meaning of the sentence can't be the sum of the meaning of the words, because apart from the sentence, the words don't have meanings. This is not just true about words. a sentence too doesn't have a specific meaning when you look at it alone, apart from its context. If you're in a meeting and your boss says, "Who will send out the email?" and you say, "I can do that," then the sentence "I can do that" is a promise to send out an email. If somebody says, "Nobody can run a mile in 3 minutes," and you say, "I can do that," then the sentence "I can do that" is a boast about your superhuman athletic capabilities. And so on. Just like a word only has a determinate specific meaning in the sentence, so a sentence only has a determinate specific meaning in a larger context. So we see holism all over the place. Smaller units of meaning have their meaning only by virtue of being part of a larger unit of meaning. And of course those larger units have their meaning only because they consist of the smaller parts of which they do in fact consist. Change the sentence and the meaning of the words change. Change the words and the meaning of the sentence changes. In talking about holism, we have also seen a second key insight of hermeneutics, which is the insight that the context which determines something's meaning is unlimited. The precise meaning of this word depends on the precise meaning of this sentence, but that depends on the precise meaning of the paragraph, which depends on the precise meaning of the chapter, and so on. What exactly does the word honor mean for Shakespeare? Well, it could be useful to look at all his works to find out. And not just his works, but works written by other people in his time, or about his time, or older works which he might have read, and so on. In principle, there is no limit to the amount of material that you could study in order to refine your interpretation of one word in one text. Now we can define what the hermeneutic circle is. The hermeneutic circle is a process of interpretation in which we continually move between smaller and larger units of meaning in order to determine the meaning of both. Here's how that works. You read a sentence. As your eyes move across the words, you have a first guess about what the words mean. So you start with a preliminary interpretation of the words. From that preliminary interpretation, you construct an interpretation of the sentence as a whole. With that interpretation of the sentence, you look back at the individual words and determine whether your original interpretation made sense. If not, you revise it. And you then also revise your interpretation of the sentence based on this new interpretation of the words. And so on, until you are happy with your interpretation. Then you can go on to the next sentence, which might make you revise your interpretation of the first sentence again. And so on. We continually revise our interpretations of the smaller units of meaning based on our current interpretations of the larger units of meaning, which, in turn, leads us to new and improved interpretations of those larger units of meaning themselves. Most of the time, this process takes very little time, and we are hardly conscious of it. But when interpretation becomes difficult, we have to do the same thing more slowly and more consciously. Why is the hermeneutic circle called the hermeneutic circle? Because we move back and forth between the smaller and the bigger unit, improving our interpretation of both every time we make the circular movement. By reflecting on Shakespeare's concept of honor, we increase our understanding of his work as a whole. By reflecting on his work as a whole, we increase our understanding of his concept of honor. By reflecting on what Shakespeare thought about honor, we increase our understanding of what the Renaissance in general thought about honor. And again, also the other way around. So we move back and forth between two or often more different levels of analysis, interpreting the context in terms of its elements and the elements in terms of their context. The longer we do this, and the more different levels of analysis we use, the better our interpretations should become. Does this process ever come to an end? Is there a perfect interpretation? And if so, can we reach it? Different hermeneuticists would answer those questions in different ways. But classical hermeneutics would say the following. Yes, there is a perfect interpretation. It is what the original author meant or thought. You have found the right interpretation of Shakespeare's concept of honor if you have the interpretation that exactly matches what Shakespeare himself thought about honor. However, classical hermeneutics would go on to say, you can never know that you have reached that perfect interpretation. For there is always more context that you could apply to the problem. It is always possible to go once more round the hermeneutic circle. And every time you do that, it may turn out that your previous interpretations were wrong, or at least inaccurate. So, while applying the hermeneutic circle brings us closer to the right interpretation, we can never know for sure that we have gotten there.